Total isolation from the outside world, hard physical labor every day, and lack of proper medical treatment. More than 30 people with alcohol and drug addictions. Their documents were confiscated, they were locked in a private house and promised their lives would be spared. In reality, they were exploited and their relatives were forced to pay. No, this isn't from a dystopian film or horror movie. It's the reality in Prykarpattia, specifically Kolomaya and the nearby village of Sopiv, just 15 minutes away. Sopiv is a small village with about 2,500 residents, and that's according to official data. So, once again, everyone here knows each other, and uninvited guests are noticed right away. Accordingly, when some strangers appeared in the village, whether they bought or rented one of the local houses, the residents became even more alert. They grew concerned as more outsiders entered the house. Why do I say they became concerned, and not just extremely curious? Because every day, strange sounds came from the house, sounds that locals said were either screams or moans. Without any explanation from the uninvited guests, the residents asked the village authorities what was happening. First, rumors spread in the village about seriously ill people staying in the house. Second, there were the newcomers. Really behaved strangely. The head of the village, Lubov Shavgenyuk, says that she couldn't get into the house with the strangers herself. You can't just break into private property like that, it's still illegal. So, within her authority, the woman turned to law enforcement. However, the only thing law enforcement managed to establish was the sheer mess that reigned inside. The unknown individuals mostly remained unidentified, because judging by information from open sources, they couldn't even find out the names of everyone who was in the house. However, it was established that they are part of the unknown group. They present themselves as representatives of a rehabilitation center for drug and alcohol addicts, respectively. Most of those who were in the house were struggling with their illnesses. In short, here is what the head of the village found out.
I couldn't get in there myself, so I turned to the police. We went to the place, checked all the people, studied who they were, and I asked for them to be evicted from our village. They replied it was only a rumor, no facts, and said they should be evicted. They claimed to be a rehabilitation center, so I asked to see their doctors, recovery facilities, psychiatrists, and narcologists. They admitted they had none, just a therapist. I questioned how they could be a rehab center without those, and they said they only had a therapist, who is for general illnesses.
Let's summarize what residents, village authorities, and law enforcement established together. Some unknown people came to the village, occupied a house, called it a rehabilitation center without any proper documents or staff, and settled drug and alcohol addicts there. Either these people were cured, or this is suspicious to say the least. It's no surprise residents protested the questionable rehab center's activities. No one knew why the organization's representatives wouldn't speak openly with them or involve the church, a respected local authority. No irony?
The team has a negative attitude toward this center.
If only they had come to us, maybe we could have been together, done something together, that would have been good. People even went out to protest, and our village council head was there, and even some local police officers, and maybe someone else from the authorities came too.
When the case started to get publicity, journalists became interested, and the media were able to record a comment from the center's representative. The man's name is Yevhen Yelistrotov. He stated that he himself is from Mariupol and is a former drug addict who was helped by such rehabilitation.
This center is engaged in the rehabilitation of people who have life problems with alcohol and drug addiction. I can tell you a little about myself. I am a former drug addict. I used drugs for 16 years. I am 33 years old and I injected every day. My parents are well-off people in Mariupol. They took me to all the countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States. I was everywhere, in all the clinics, but nothing helped me. But when the guys from this center came, they traveled 1,500 kilometers to Mariupol from here, and they took me, offered me to go and try. I grabbed onto it like it was my last straw.
By the way, pay attention to the name of the center, Church of the New Generation. We'll come back to this name later. So, who is right? Is it the outraged residents who suspected something fishy in the work of the rehabilitation center, or its representative? Fortunately, the police received testimonies beyond those from both sides of the conflict. And not just any testimonies, but from those who were treated for addictions in this center, and I say treated in quotation marks. Because what was happening behind the closed doors of the Sopivsky house had nothing to do with this process. The only thing that saved the lives of the people who ended up imprisoned was escape, and it was escape that allowed them to go to law enforcement with their statements. Having survived the horrors of the so-called rehabilitation, they decided not to stay silent and to report everything they had seen and heard personally. These testimonies were already enough for an investigation to begin, and law enforcement officers started to verify the information they received. They confirmed there was no rehab center in the house the Sopi village residents complained about. Rather, where there is a rehab center, the people who ended up in this center were literally treated as slaves. They were kidnapped, cut off from the world, stripped of documents and communication, and forced into physical labor. And the money, well, of course, was taken away from some people.
They were taken against their will, according to testimony, even from train stations, public places, and the street. You could say either by deception, or they could simply take people by the arms and bring them there.
Those who didn't agree with the established rules were beaten. Additionally, these patients' relatives had to pay a monthly upkeep fee. Next is a comment from Maximiv, head of the investigative department.
Relatives of those placed there paid between 1,500 to 5,000. The amount depended on their financial situation. They took away passports and phones. Relatives understood that probably isolation was necessary to treat this person. There was only a registered public organization, and they didn't have any other documents as a rehabilitation center or medical institution.
Besides the village, 2 similar rehab centers were also operating in Kolomia, setting up pseudo-treatment points. 6 criminals have had cases opened against them for at least that many people. Among those detained are the 31-year-old organizer and accomplices, the oldest of whom is 35, and the youngest is 22 years old. In total, in 2018, the police rescued 32 people from labor slavery, 3 of whom were children. It was a 1.5-year-old baby, and her kids were 7 and 9. The criminals' scheme operated for 2 years. At that time, people who really needed medical treatment were not given it. They weren't even properly fed. They lived in disorder, some slept right on the floor, sometimes under blankets of questionable quality, and sometimes without any blankets at all. Of all the things included in the addiction treatment program, they only had isolation and work therapy. But as they say, don't confuse wrong with right. The key point is how all of this was organized and for what purpose. Official rehabilitation centers have the appropriate licenses and real medical staff. And just as importantly, addicts can leave the rehabilitation center on their own. Of course, there are certain conditions. Such a person and their relatives will have to sign documents about refusing further treatment. But the very fact that this option exists is extremely important. If you really decide to leave, you can leave. And what was happening in Prykarpattia, in the 3 mentioned houses, has nothing to do with rehabilitation. Chief Dr. Valery Skopich of the Ivano-Frankivsk Regional Narcological Dispensary specifically emphasized this.
It's hard for me to even call this any kind of therapy or an organization with a medical focus. It's also hard to call it that because there's no sign, no specific structure, no specialists. Well, what can we even talk about? In my opinion, it's just some dirty business that's covered up with so-called good intentions, in quotes, just to make some money off other people's misfortune.
Skopich said the criminals exploited emotional exhaustion, targeting addicts' relatives with flyers or sympathy when they were most vulnerable. On the street. Sometimes it is so hard for the relatives of addicts to be around someone who can't give up a harmful habit that they are willing to do anything just to make it stop.
I just feel sorry for those relatives who, being in a state of codependency, don't understand what they're doing. They reach such a psychological, stressful state that they're willing to agree to anything just to protect themselves as quickly as possible. Because being around, living with a person who is constantly a traumatizing factor, even if it's a close relative. But sometimes parents even wish for the worst, just so we would stop bothering them sooner, unable in that state to properly assess the situation, let alone remember that it's better to consult specialists first.
Those whom law enforcement freed from slavery have returned to their families. I don't know if they stopped using after what they went through, but, as the police representative involved in the case noted, Every person should have the freedom of choice.
I rule out that these people are there. Tomorrow or the day after, any of them could again start down the path of using alcohol or drugs. Everyone has the unconditional right to choose, guaranteed by the Constitution and law.
For the illegal deprivation of liberty of others and their labor exploitation, as well as the violence committed, the suspect in this crime faces from 5 to 12 years in prison. Is this a happy ending? I wouldn't say that. Remember, I told you to note the name of the center closed by law enforcement. The journalist's report called it the Church of the New Generation, but this caption may be incorrect. The police withheld the name. If you take a few minutes to Google, you'll find the Church of the New Generation and its so-called rehabilitation centers, which are more accurately described as pseudo-rehabilitation centers. Media data shows these institutions operate much like the 3 previously closed by law enforcement. The same story. No official registrations, no medical staff, abductions of people, forced labor. There are even mentions that people died in these centers, allegedly beaten to death. Journalists conducted their own investigation and found that as of 2021, there were about 250 new generation centers operating in Ukraine. Interestingly, their representative Dmytro didn't even try to deny the facts of death. Here is his quote.
We're not perfect, we ask for help, we ask for advice, we try to keep track of all this, but please understand we're not working with the cabinet of ministers. I'm very sad that this is happening, that there are 1 or 2 cases, I'm working on this, and all the leaders are trying to make sure this doesn't happen.
Within the church, the new generation has pulled away from center activities. The official response was,
Rehabilitation centers are independent legal entities overseen by Ukrainian state authorities like the tax service, police, and prosecutor's office.
Although, again, journalists have found evidence that proves the opposite. The churches and centers are closely linked. This is evidenced by phone conversations between their representatives, during which they discuss in particular the issue of money received from pseudo-treatment of addicts in Ukraine. Judging by the data in the registries, these churches are still functioning, and it's unlikely that all the centers attached to them have closed.